Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Let's go to Rashi now. I think that we are on verse 7, right? We made reference to verse 6. Rashi is not on it, but we can read it again quickly just to get some momentum. Chapter 1 of Shemot, verse 6, Vayamot Yosef v'chol achav. Yosef died and all of his brothers, v'chol hador hahu, and the entire generation. And we lingered on that in terms of who is included, who's not included. We also talked about why Rashi doesn't make the argument yet that really everyone who was alive at that time has died. Several generations passed because he wants to preserve, or I don't know which order he did this in. Either he already knows the comment he's going to make on verse 8, or once he realized the comment he's going to make on verse 8, he decided to not go in the direction that some of the other commentators went in terms of discussing who else might be alive from the generation. But for the now, the Torah says that Yosef is gone, his brothers are gone, and everyone from that generation, right? There are a lot of ways of understanding it. Everyone from Joseph's generation, or everyone who was alive when Joseph was alive, it's unclear, but time has passed, right? It's actually a pretty rare temporal scene change in the Torah. Sometimes we jump ahead by a lot of years in the Torah without the Torah telling us that that's happening. We can just infer it. Here, the Torah says, right? Doodaloo, 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 right? New scene, new era, right? And now we get to verse number 7. Matt, do you want to read Bnei Israel?
Bnei Israel Haru Vayishlechu V'Yirbu Vaya'atzmu U'Me'od Timalei Ha'aretz.
Okay, but we didn't do the Rashi on it.
Right. Okay. And so, the children of Israel, they were fruitful and they swarmed, and they were great, they were mighty, they became mighty, very much so, and land was filled with them.
Good. And we discussed how one way of understanding the four verbs, potentially, is A, B, where the A's represent something empirical, and the B's represent the experience of that growth had upon the inhabitants. They became many. It was experienced as if they were swarmed, right? They grew. It was experienced as if they were growing too strong, almost setting up verse 8, which we all know is coming because it's such an important verse in the history and the psyche of the Jewish people that the people we were living amongst thought that we were getting to be too great. Okay.
Quick grammatical question.
Yeah.
Did we talk about the bet in the first ma'od? Bin od?
We talked about the doubling of the ma'od, but not the bet. Correct. We didn't talk about the bet so much.
Can you just explain that briefly?
No. I don't have a great explanation for it. If you look quickly, Unkelus takes it out. Unkelus takes vayatzmu and turns it into utakifu. They became strong. And whatever the force of the preposition of the bet in ma'od is, Unkelus into Aramaic just turns it into lachta, lots and lots. So the best way I could possibly render it in English is, and they strengthened with muchness. That there's an implied with in English, or in English it would be a with. Do any of the translations give any nod towards that bet?
Increased very greatly.
Very greatly. So no preposition.
Very, very much so.
What? Say that again.
That's the ma'od, which is a Hebraic thing that nobody mentioned last week that knows more than I did. But when Hebrew puts the two words together like that, or in Samuel, na'ar, that means very young, for instance.
Right.
Not just a young lad, but a very young lad.
So that's the doubling.
Very, very. And it's consistent throughout the Torah that these doublings occur.
Sometimes a sneeze is just a sneeze, okay?
6 feet 2 inches, I'm afraid.
Right. So but does any other translation have render the bet at all?
Oliver just says very fast.
Very fast, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's probably some implied almost like imagine an adverb operating as a noun, right? So it's an adverb because it's describing the growth, but it's nounifying the adverb. So with muchliness, something like that. Okay. On our Rashi, and it can be different if you have a different Rashi, you first have words in brackets, right? With a small footnote 5 that tells you that it doesn't appear in all printing, and then you have the shorter comment of the Rashi with footnote 6. I want to read the shorter comment of the Rashi first because that's the one that's obviously Rashi, or that's everyone agrees is Rashi, and then we'll go back and look at the Paru. So on Vayishritzu, Matt, did you have a question, Rick?
Little trope, Josh, before we leave Moed.
Sure.
So, just hit me. So the AB, if the A's, those verbs are for the Israelites, and the B's are for the Egyptians, okay, how they felt about things. So the first Moed could be for the Israelites, and the second Moed that has Yet Nachta, that's the high point or the midpoint of the sentence, that's for the Egyptians. So kind of like the hysteria, if it is, about the virus, the Egyptians really felt, or somebody felt in the Egyptian hierarchy that the Israelites were really a serious problem.
You say that
that mode was more than the other mode.
Uh-huh. Are you saying that one of the ma'ods refers to the first and the third verbs, and the second ma'od refers to the second and fourth verbs?
Maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. Matt, let's read Vayishritzu, and can someone pass down the Purell again? Because since I did sneeze, I'd like to purify. Okay. The keres.
You don't have to say this. My version of this is of Israeli stuff. The Rashi is a Rashi script. It's Minukad.
How dare it be in Rashi script?
Rashi script is where
Rashi never had to learn Rashi.
That's true. Rashi also wasn't able to learn Rashi with Rashi.
Well,
Yeah.
so the
Yeah, well,
what is it?
so the word is keres, but yes, if you were pointing, it would be becheres because the dot comes out of the right. Anyone know what keres is? It could be a pocket, but here it means it's a womb. It's another word for a womb. There's a famous Mishnah in Masechet, I believe, Megillah, might be Rosh Hashanah, that is the back and forth between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabban Gamliel on rabbinic authority and deciding who has the authority to determine when the new moon is. And there's some reference in there that a witness said that they saw the moon one night and didn't see the moon the next night. And so the question is, can that witness be, which of those two testimonies should be believed? And to make a long story short, there's a reference there to, it can't be that a woman is not pregnant one day and then pregnant the other day, right? That it has to be the other direction, right? You go from pregnant to the baby being out, not the baby being out and being pregnant again. And the use there in Mishnaic Hebrew is not rechem, which is what we use for womb, but keres, okay? That's what the word means. What does the phrase mean? What Rashi says, and they swarmed, meaning what?
It says that they would give birth six children per womb.
Right, 6 tuplets, okay? So Rashi quotes the Midrash in Tanchuma that says, this Vayishritzu, as opposed to the Paru means they had a lot of children. Vayishritzu means they had a lot of children per pregnancy, right? What's the play there? Why is that? Forget about the fanciful notion of it. Why is that an apt reading of Vayishritzu as a commentary on Paru? What is a sheretz?
Reptiles.
It's a swarming, creepy crawler thing, and it's a reference usually to species that have multiple births, right? So paru means that they were fecund, and they were all very fertile, and children were born. Vayishritzu means that in this generation they were able to actually produce the way Shvatzim produce, which is they become many much more quickly than humans become many. Okay, that's the midrash in Parshat in Tanchuma. There's a super commentary on Rashi. I forgot which one it is. It says that there are differences of opinions as to why 6. Right, and for the moment, just put aside that the rabbi's command of zoology was not perfect, but it doesn't mean that they knew nothing. Right, and so some believe that the reference to 6 is that 6 represents the normal load of children for what's considered the largest of the shratzim, which is the achbar, the big field mouse, right? And some people believe that it's the normal load of children for the smallest of the shratzim, which is the akrab, achbar akrab, which is a scorpion. I know nothing about how many babies either field mice or scorpions have, but according to this, that it wasn't just a random number, that it was the rabbi's way of understanding in the shratzim that they knew, either the largest or the smallest, what was the average litter. 6. Stevie?
No, just that there are 6 words.
That's what's in this one.
That could be what you have that as a footnote?
No, I have that as a middle school.
It's also in parenthesis. It says the 6 words from paru to mode suggest or imply the number 6.
Right. And of course, if you start counting with Bnei Yisrael, it suggests 8. And if you go all the way in the verse, it suggests 11.
That's apparently from Midrash, not Kuman.
So that's one possibility. And anyone else want to make a comment on that as the impact of Vayishvat Sue, and then Marshall?
Well, I think this is the thread I haven't worked it out entirely in my mind, but the 4, I have faith off on that. Not that 4.
Gee, why?
I was just thinking about the 4 sons and these 4 verbs of paru, shritzu, yirbu, yasmu. They have different qualities about them. That shritzu has something a little, native in there, and I just, when I said I haven't worked this out in my mind, I don't know where the parallels would be, but something tells me that there's something there.
The 4?
That those 4 words in particular could have parallels to the 4 sons.
I see. Right. The four verbs that shows the increase into Egypt you're saying could.
The attitudes and
Yeah.
kind of how the 4 qualities of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe echoed in the 4.
Marshall, then Alexandra, then I want to go back to the Rashi itself.
Susan said the negative implication of the word vayishritzu is softened by the Targumist, by the Onkelos, where it says with Yisrael nefish yaldu, that they increased and they gave birth. So they don't want to cast aspersions on Bnei Yisrael and say, well, they really proliferated like reptiles. No,
Right.
They just gave birth.
Right.
Softening it, making it more soft.
Right. And so Onkelos' softening of Vayishritzu amplifies the oddness of Vayishritzu, right? The Torah referring to the Israelites as the thing that are going to become considered treif and detestable to their offspring, right? And I don't have to tell you how evocative it is of centuries of propaganda against Jews or against anyone who's considered to be the other and swarming, right? The growth of my family lands very differently psychologically than the growth of your family if you're an other, right? So it's a very strange word. It's a very strange midrash that says that they gave birth to sextuplets. I don't think the rabbis really wanted the readers of the midrash to believe that miracles were happening and 6 babies were being born per pregnancy. But it's trying to deal with why the Torah would have chosen the word vayishvatzu, and again, maybe an indication that we're supposed to understand that verb as the experience that the Egyptians had in seeing this growth to set up the verse that's coming. Alexandra.
So I think what I'm about to say was probably easily misunderstood, but so I hope it comes out right. But to me that seems so odd, this explanation. And when we were looking at this paragraph or this sentence last week, I was thinking that it, to me, sounds not so much that this is how the Egyptians described the Israelites, but this is how God described this generation of the Israelites, because they were no longer like people described by their soul, their nefesh. They were now described by their behavior, and they became very, very strong. That's kind of the way you talk to a child. Oh, you're very, very strong, and meaning they're not. The way your story last week explained that. To me, it's the way God described this generation of having lost touch with their souls.
Mm-hmm. The Torah definitely wants us to imagine, either from God's perspective or from the Egyptians' perspective, some huge and exponential increase. Up until now, we've known the name of everyone in the tribe, at least of the males, right? But we're able to count them, right? Monem mispar lakochavim. God can count all the stars, but we only count the people that we know. And all of a sudden, the Torah wants us to imagine that one, right? So Vayishrutzu does go and on some level, thank goodness, because without that tremendous increase, you can play this both ways. Without the tremendous increase on the one hand, perhaps Pharaoh would not have gotten so nervous and wouldn't have enslaved us. On the other hand, had they not become such an enormous nation, could they possibly have withstood and survived the enslavement? They would have just been they would have been eliminated, right? So there's also a catch-22 in the impact of the exponential growth. It both invites the oppression and gives a numerical bulwark against the oppression. Many ancient peoples have been enslaved and they're gone. Stevie, Larry, Sue?
Just about whether to take this literally or not. I mean,
the Rashi literally or the Torah literally?
The Midrash.
Okay.
But the Torah does seem to imply going from, like you said, 70 people to hundreds of thousands, right? In 4 generations or so.
Right.
So, right.
I don't think it's as little as 4 generations.
Depends on which family. But in a handful of generations, that sort of increase does seem to require a supernatural,
Yeah, and again, v'chol hador hahu, talk about how closely we read that phrase. Does that mean literally one generation? Is that the Torah's way of saying a long time later, right? And that's also going to come up again in the next verse. And there was a new king over Egypt. The next new king, right? Or many generations of pharaonic leaders later. You're right. By the time they're enslaved, by the time they emerge from slavery, you've gone from 70. We have a number, 70 at least of the people come down to hundreds of thousands, right? So there's got to be some way midrashically to explain that. Right. Larry, and then
if Aleph means thousand.
Good. Larry, Sue, Barry.
Take off from what Alexandra and what Rabbi Kligfeld said. There's 2 ways to look at immigrants and immigrants expanding in any society. And one is the fearful way, which is expressed here. They swarmed. But the other is to say they arrived and they prospered.
Yeah.
If you just use the word prosper in your mind,
right,
and they prospered and they grew and they then expanded into society, you have a very positive outlook.
Yeah.
Both the Torah, but also all the commentary. From what I can tell, none of the commentators actually try to even go in the other direction at all.
Right.
I would rather think that the Hebrews, because they filled the land, they prospered and they became great. That became a source of fear, but nobody says that, so I have no hook to hang it on.
The Vayatzmu opens itself more to being able to be read on a pshat level as great strength versus frightening strength. Vayishritzu has built into our associations with the word a negative connotation. We've played a lot with roots before, right? So the first 2 letters of 3-letter roots families, and we've also played around with, sometimes it's the second 2 letters of a root as opposed to the first 2 letters that suggest a family. Sometimes when you have the first and the third letters the same and the second letter are similar, they're also potentially from a similar family. So sheretz and sheketz, they're not directly etymologically related, but they're also not completely unrelated. And sheketz is something detestable. Sheretz is something that swarms. In the Torah, in Parshat Shmini, the things that are short seam are the things that we have to lishaketz. make detestable and not eat them. So the word itself has a baseline negative connotation differently than Vayatzmu. You're right, the Torah is explaining this as they swarmed like creepy crawlies. Sue, Barry.
I always like to go back to the end of the last part where it said that there's the Pakadi's code. I'm counting you, I'm acknowledging each of you.
Yeah.
And we went through sentences from there to Yishutsu, and there's no more Pakadi's code. We're not. I'm not. God isn't putting his finger on each one. It went crazy. I think. I mean, but it's just an it's a very and now the story diverges significantly in that way too.
Yeah, and the story is diverging significantly numerically in verse 7, and the story is diverging on a plot level in verse 8. Verse 8, we are going to go from prosperousness and comfort and ease to the main storyline of the Jewish people, right? Or at least of the Torah, enslavement. Barry.
Just on mathematics, if we can take from some literature approximating Joseph's death at 128, and he was 17 when he was abducted, and how long was he in Egypt before Jacob came? How long was he in Egypt before Jacob came?
He was there
13 years, and then Jacob lived 17 years further. So add all that, subtract it from 128, and that's how many years they reproduced. How long? Can you give a number on that?
Right.
128 minus 17 plus 13 plus 17.
It's in the 70s or 80s.
Okay.
Unless more time has passed, then it's fine.
That's a relatively short time.
Yeah. Look at now, for those of you who have the previous comment in Rashi, in the brackets. Again, in our printing we have it, but not every comment of Rashi will have it. Do you have it, Matt?
I have it on the Safari, but Ukru, that one?
Paru, yeah.
Paru, okay. Paru, Shemot, Kligfeld, which is the hymn, below, Make, which is the hymn, Kanim. So their wives did not have miscarriages, and they didn't die when they were.
So there's a comment attributed maybe to Rashi just on Paru, and so if Vayishritzu meant that they gave birth to many per pregnancy, that's kind of supernatural. Paru is something natural, but also rare and wonderful. That in that generation, neither were they miscarrying, nor were they dying in infancy, right? So you can imagine them as a couplet, right? Rashi saying Paru means the things that sometimes happen when women of that generation gave birth always happen, which means that they survived childbirth and survived pregnancy and survived childhood, and also Vayishritzu, that the whole process was under some kind of a mathematical supernatural equation. The problem is that it's very likely that that comment that we read second, but appears first in the verse, was not in the original printing of Rashi anyway, but it's there. But it does set up what I wanted to read even more interestingly, which is Rashbam, which is Rashi's grandson. If you have in our book, it's on the right side of the column, second one down. I'll read this one, as he deals with these verbs. Paru beherayon, they were many in pregnancy, which could mean they got pregnant a lot, or there were many per pregnancy. It's hard to know which one he means by that. Vayishritzu, and they swarmed, leida, when it came to actually giving birth. Shalosh shikla harechem, that the womb did not bereave itself, meaning there it's a reference to miscarry. So it may be, if you put those two together, that it means that there were many pregnancies and many babies per pregnancy, paru, vayishritzu, and when it came time to be turned into living human beings, they were born alive. Jump to vayirbu, gadlu, v'nasu haktanim dolim. They survived childhood, right? They grew, and the younger ones became Bigger ones, Shalom metu b'katnutam, they didn't die in their childhood. Ve'ya'atzmu, Shalom metu anashim, and even adults had lower mortality rates. Ela chayu harbeh, rather they lived many years, right? So Rashbam breaks down the four, not to our A-B, but suggesting different stages, right? They got pregnant, they were born, they survived childhood, and they didn't die young, right? If that happens to one, and only one part of a population in an era where mortality rates at all four of those stages are much higher than we can imagine, that's going to have a disproportionate impact on the size of the population, right? So Rashbam, as a census taker, as someone who understands civics, does a good job of filling that gap. How do we get from being 70 people in a nation to overwhelming a nation? Some version of natural and supernatural impact on the birth. Sue?
You think they closed the yeshivas for coronavirus?
Then?
They're relative growth.
Well, quarantine could produce a child boost.
Oh, maybe.
Right, as it did, I think I talked about this on Rosh Hashanah, that 9.5 months after the first Gulf War in Israel, there was a child boom because Israelis were up in the middle of the night. Barbara.
Another factor becomes, and we read that people like Joseph lived 128. The question is, what was the life cycle in those days? A lot of these people that we've read about, Methuselah living to 900 or something, but yet what was the average age that people lived? And in those days, people didn't live as long as we live nowadays.
Right.
I think. And they also started to procreate at a younger age. Wives were taken at 12, 13, 14 when they had their periods, when they became adults.
Correct.
And that would allow them a little bit of a longer time to be having children, which would cause more children per family than it would be nowadays. We kind of watch it more than they did then.
Yeah. Starting earlier, fewer of them surviving, but more years of active childbearing years. Correct. Corey and then Larry. Sorry. Larry, Corey, Larry.
So I'm new to this.
Please.
But why would we just not assume that the time period was elongated? And especially when they say a new king arose over Egypt who did not know about Joseph. If he didn't know about Joseph, why are we not just assuming it's maybe 15 generations?
Right. So we don't know. This is one of the innumerable places in the Torah where it's terse, and therefore it's ambiguous and subject to interpretation. Because you're watching the rabbis of the Midrashic era and the medieval era, like trying to figure that very thing out. Is this just a generation and a half? Then how do you make sense of the numbers? Or is this the Torah was saying a long time later? And that's how, and you're going to see Rashi playing with that and struggling with that in his next commentary. We don't know how to understand the new king. Is it the next new king? Was he not new at all? Or is it many new kings later? It's terse. Like we understand if we're reading the story as a Cliff Notes, right? We get it. There were not a lot of Jews. Then there were a lot of Jews, and the Egyptians got nervous. But because we're not reading them as a Cliff Notes, but like we're reading every Shakespearean accent, we want to figure out how much information is gettable, and so much of the information is through our instinctual read. The Torah doesn't provide it. All the Torah says is that generation's dead. Okay, we get that. There are many more. We get that. There's a new Pharaoh. We get that. One generation, 5, 20, 30. Don't know. Larry, then Norm.
Well, I just want to thank you because it's Rashbam who supports my alternative reading.
Okay.
Because 3 of the 4 things he talks about are attributes of more developed, prosperous societies. That they have more infants actually, more births actually survive, lower infant mortality in the first year of life, and longer mortality. So in effect, and even the first one, more births. If you think about the demographic inertia, it takes time for a society to reduce the number of births as they grow richer. Richer societies have fewer births because they need fewer births. So he's arguing that they prospered.
Yeah, right. He's arguing for a natural a natural prospering, but a natural prospering more so than the people around them. Right? Conception, birth, childhood, longer lives. Yeah. Norm.
When we talk about a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, I think it's not likely that it was simply merely another Pharaoh. What I've learned in the past from some sources is that it starts a new dynasty. Because if you were the Pharaoh who had prospered so greatly by having Joseph as your sidekick, your child, your grandchildren are likely to know about that.
Right.
Be taught about that, be taught about the importance of these people, how to use them for your own benefit, perhaps. Somewhat Machiavellian.
Yeah.
But if that dynasty falls and a new dynasty arises, whether they're invaders from the east or elsewhere, or they're nativists or whatever, that knows not just knows that really means, I think in this case, not just didn't know him personally, but didn't have a commitment to anything that he brought to Egypt. And so for them, here's an identifiable group that's associated with the previous dynasty. It makes sense that they're not going to be Philo-Semitic.
Right.
And it may well be that it was that the previous dynasty was a Semitic dynasty or the dynasty from the east, that it was running things, but they fall and the natives comes up in there. They don't like anybody who they can paint with the tarnish of being foreigners.
Right, and so two things before Matt comments. One, just to be very precise, we haven't read that verse yet. Like, we all know what's coming, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that verse. And your comment is the fuel that fuels the engine of Rashi's next two comments, because we will not know how to make sense of the newness of this king, because we can't make sense of our own recent good history being eliminated. Right? We also live in an era where history is recorded in a different way. But you're exactly right, which is why Rashi can't figure out which way to go. Rashi is going to give us a very unusual saying, it's either this way or this way. It doesn't tell you which one he thinks it should be. Matt.
Norm's comment, I think, but they may have remembered somehow, the people may have remembered the Soviet foundation of the Egyptian economy under and there might have been some deep resentment. But this whole question of how long, it seems to me to take away from the narrative of our story. Just the way it's written is so strong. The new came. It's like, the light changed, dark all of a sudden.
Right. Right.
It's almost not an effort in terms of a story. I wouldn't want to have details about how long it was.
Right.
Because the point is that it's changing.
Well, when we slow things down, here's a tautology. When we slow things down, we slow things down. And when you slow down a record, it doesn't have its same musical lyricism, right? So, right, we really slowed things down, right? And you're right that all of the midrashic and medieval attempts to make sense of this almost reduces some of its epicness, right? It's less of an interesting movie if there's an explanation for how this all happened. And if you read it a little more quickly, not over quickly, it's, as you said, 72. Wow, there are Israelites everywhere, right? And it might make sense as a imbiber of the story to just let that be, right? But the rabbis never let anything be. Let's read verse 8, because we've been referring to it a lot, and we're going to spend a good amount of time on it. So, verse 8, Vayakom. Everyone see where we are? Rebecca, you want to read?
Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. And there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Yosef.
Okay. A classic example of a verse that has no hard words, no hard syntax, there's no question of what it means, but we already have spent a half an hour pre-discussing what it means, right? Very rudimentary Hebrew. The only word that you could have a question about why it's that word, and another word is vayakom, right? Vayakom from the root kam, which means to get up or to rise up. Why it could have been vayahi melech hadash, there was, or vayimaneh, appointed, or something. But even there, we kind of know what it means, right? But we don't know how to put this sentence into its proper context. Rick?
Vayakom the sun rises in the east, and the Pharaoh was related to the sun god Ra, and to go along with what Norm was saying, different dynasties. There was a whole thing about the Pharaoh thought he was God, actually in physical form, but there was a rebellion against that, and there was a issue of that. But when I see Vayakam, like you said, it's not appointed, it's not elected or chosen or whatever. It's rising, like there's an Egyptian influence there.
Interesting. Before we look at some of the commentaries, and on top of the questions we've already pre-asked on this verse, as we anticipated, any other questions you would ask in the verse? Diane?
Yeah, the use of the verb yada as opposed to makir.
Makir?
Yeah, so maybe the translation is more like didn't know about Yosef as opposed to didn't know Yosef.
Yeah.
That's what my translation says.
Didn't know about.
Yeah. So in modern Hebrew, in general, Yodea is knowledge and Makir is familiarity with a person. Right. In general, they're also somewhat interchangeable. So you're saying if it was know the person, it would have made sense to be more Makir. In fact, that's what Rasad Gaon says top right. Asher lo yada, he says Shelo hikir, right? In biblical Hebrew, yada is both more of an interesting verb because it has that connotation of intimacy, sometimes carnal intimacy. It's also the case that yada can just mean knowing a person. So yada is both more of an interesting verb and less of an interesting verb in the Bible. But I'm glad you raised that, and keep that in mind as we read the Uncle list. Tova, and then Rebecca.
Just a question on yada again. Could it be understood in terms of that he did not acknowledge Joseph?
Yeah. To not show his acknowledgement of Yosef and Yosef's story. Yeah. Potentially.
And just a comment on building on what Norm said earlier. The fact that they indicated this is Vayakom Hadash, it does, I think, suggest the idea of a new dynasty because the members of a single dynasty were seen as almost a continuation of the same thing.
Yeah.
And so that emphasis on this is a Hadash, I think that is a possibility.
Right, as opposed to the next king.
Yeah.
New king. Rebecca?
I just thought it was interesting to use the word melech instead of paro. I always think of course they say paro when I'm looking at that, and Pharaoh said, so it's kind of like his name, paro. I mean, title, I guess. I just thought it was strange that he used the word melech.
Yeah. Right. Throughout most of the rest of the encounters between the Israelites and Moshe, it's going to be Vayomer Moshe el Paro, and here he's getting the moniker Melech Hadash. Tova, you going to say something about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on one of the interesting things about the whole passage is the use of Paro, because the word Paro to refer to the ruler of Egypt did not occur in Egypt until very late in the New Kingdom. Prior to that, Paro, what it literally means is Per'ah, it means the great house. It's like saying the White House or 10 Downing Street. And it was in that later period of the New Kingdom that it became used to refer to the king himself. And the fact that Paro is used in this account kind of places it temporally in terms of Egyptian history.
Well, it shows how well God knew in advance the development of the Egyptian language.
That's true.
When was that?
It's towards the very end of the 18th dynasty and just before the 19th dynasty.
In terms of years ago?
Oh, years from today? It was about 1300 BCE.
So that's when
Ramses.
Yeah, Ramses is, the 19th dynasty is like, right around the time of the 19th dynasty.
So that's when we started putting the Bible together.
No, that's a whole other thing.
Well, the simplest the simplest way we can understand the Torah's self-understanding of when this took place, right? If we jump over all the complications of historicizing this, it's about 12 to 1400 BCE, right? Because the Exodus is considered, around, again, if we historicize it, 1200, 1180, because you need the amount of time for them to get to the land of Canaan and have the era of the prophets before you get to what really can be historicized, which is Saul's kingdom leading to King David's kingdom around the year 1000. So it actually does make sense in terms of when we would put it on our timeline, but that doesn't answer the question as to when it was composed, right? Stevie?
Just the first that it's saying Yadai Yosef and not saying Yosef, and all of his deeds or something, right? The Volashir outside of the word. The text is terse enough that I don't know to make a mountain out of that, but it does seem like another way the text could have been written is to say Joseph and all of his deeds.
Right. And so there are two ways one can respond to that. There are 100 ways. But one is, it specifically, since it could have said Yadav kol asher asa, it doesn't mean that, because it could have said that, right? Therefore, it really means didn't know the guy, didn't know his name. Or, when it said it didn't know Joseph, what he meant was didn't know the whole story of Joseph and what he did. Look at Onkelos for a second before we look at Rashi. Onkelos is fascinating here, right? So Onkelos, Vikam, Vayakom, Malka, Melech, Chadata, Chadash, right? The shin in Hebrew becomes a taf in Aramaic. Al, Mitzrayim, Delo Mekayim Gzerat Yosef. What was new about this king? That he didn't perpetuate. You mentioned before, Matt, the Sovietization of the Egyptian economy. He didn't perpetuate Joseph's decrees, meaning what was new about this king. Whether or not he knew about Joseph, he did not keep going the economic infrastructure that Joseph had put forward, either willingly or not willingly, right? So that's his translation. So this is Onkelos about 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years before Rashi, jumping into the fray. What was new about this king? Was it right after? Did he not know the person? No, what I'm saying is that there's a new sheriff in town. And this sheriff is either not going to know or live by Joseph's rules or is going to pretend not to know by Joseph's rules, which is some fodder for Rashi's comments coming up as well.
But it's a different sheriff.
Maybe.
Then how do you translate Malkah?
I say maybe based on what Rashi's about to say.
No, but if you just read
Onkelos, yeah. I think Onkelos thinks of this as a new sheriff.
The other commentators think it's the same.
Right. Barry.
So, I haven't looked at the Rashi, but I think there's kind of a novel twist on this. But let's look at the historical context. Joseph has turned the entire country upside down. All the people are enslaved, searched themselves to Pharaoh. They lost everything. And this is all Joseph's doing. This is not a happy people with the Israelites who come in to the country. This was a young Pharaoh, I believe, when he took over. And to maintain his position, he needs to recognize what's going on. And so he professes to have, he's wiped out Joseph. And we need to restructure. We need to refresh and restructure. And that's what this is. And it's not that number of years since they arrived that this is happening. So he hasn't died yet. It's the same guy. He's young enough to still be there, and still young enough to exist through the entire story that we're going to read.
Maybe, right?
That's my twist.
Right. So what the only thing we can get from Onkelos is that he is reading, going back into Stevie's question as to what the Yada means. The Yada is some combination of knowing the person, knowing the story, acknowledging his knowing the story, and continuing to live by what he inherited in the annals of the recent history of the kingdom, right? All of that is in the Lo Yada. He didn't do any of that. Just, this is a new chapter, right? And by the way, again, if your mind is anything like my mind, you're thinking of other moments in world history where new rulers, despotic new rulers, autocratic new rulers say, Either I'm changing our definition of our recent history, or I'm pretending the recent history didn't happen, and I'm certainly changing the definition as to who we're considering loyal and who we're considering not be loyal, and whose impact on the kingdom or the nation we're going to consider to have been positive and who's not. And I'm making a decision, and once I make the decision, that's law and lore for this kingdom. You could do that if you're a pharaoh. Sometimes you can even do it if you're an elected official. Let's go around. Barbara, Sue, we'll just go a lot of hands up.
Okay, well, in sentence 6, Joseph dies, as does that generation. In sentence 7, the land becomes filled with the Israelites.
Yes.
So that's several generations to have it become filled with generations. So you're probably talking 100, 200 years in that period of time. I mean, they were there for 400 years. They didn't have the historical documents that we have now to know what went on 100 or 200 years before. So it's not surprising that the king didn't know about Joseph.
Right. So that's the argument for why it's not surprising to Joseph. That's the argument for why it's not surprising. And there are counter arguments that suggest that it's really surprising, given the fact that this Joseph character basically saved the nation from utter famine. And you would think that even in the ancient world that would have been recorded with some kind of posterity. So again, we don't know. So all these suppositions as to what the verse might be are real possibilities. And again, we're probably not going to even get to the Rashi till next week. That's what Rashi is playing with. Sue.
I was just thinking about how this is a theme of our existence is to never forget and never allow anyone who did not know what came before. Starting here, we live in that cycle where we stay very close to that story.
Yeah.
That it shouldn't happen again. Somebody who knew not where we've been.
Right. And it's also it's not only Pesach related, it's also Purim related, right? Parshat Zachor and Timchet Zecher Amalek Lo Tishkach, and it's amazing. Every year on Purim, during the times in the Gilad Reading that I get to kind of just be in the pew and not either reading myself or running the services, I end up not intentionally, just this happens unconsciously, focusing on a different part of the story to just zoom in on. Right? I intentionally come to the Megillah reading without commentaries. I want to read the pshat. I want to hear the pshat come into my mind. This year, certainly unconsciously related to this class today, I was not aware that I was making the connection. I kept thinking about how many references there are in the Purim story about writing things down, recording it, being recorded in the annals of Medes and Persia, and Mordechai recording it and making sure it's recorded, and they did it because he recorded, and then all the Jews are going to know this, and they're going to know it because it was recorded and recorded. Like the notion of keeping this story, however fanciful, half historical it is, keeping it as a way of impacting our behavior 2,500 years later is a very, very Jewish thing. It's also a human thing, but it's not the same. It doesn't have the same impact in every human civilization, right? So we don't know. Tova, I'm sure, knows a bit more than all of us does, but we don't know exactly how Egyptian record keeping took place 2,500 years ago. But even if it took place well, we're also aware of the power of a particular type of leader to ignore or change or make disappear history. That's a powerful thing.
In our modern world, it's all about God.
Yeah. Marshall.
I was thinking Onkelos must have looked at this verse by Yaakov Melech Hadash and said, gee, I know this word by Yaakov in a different form. I know it in a PL form. So therefore he said, not only did a new king arise, but also he did not fulfill something. So that's what I think what brought about Onkelos' comment. He didn't want, the Torah does not repeat the word, the shoresh kum, in the same verse.
Right.
But Onkelos had no problems using the same verse.
Spell out, Marshall, what you're saying, because I'm not sure that connection is obvious to everyone around the table.
Well, the shoresh, the root of the word like kupa bam, is like a pa'al form, and then the kayin is a pl form, which is a stronger form.
Right.
So kum, he arose. Okay, what's the big deal about he arose?
Yeah.
But the kayin, he actually fulfilled something, but here it's below kiyin, he did not fulfill.
Right. I had not picked up on that. It can't be an accident, right? Because Rashi is a master of the words. Likayim is to make the thing that got established last, right? So it's kam likayim, very good, right? By the way, that verb is also in the Megillah, right? Kimu v'kiblu. The Israelites, established and they accepted and established this rule that Purim would be observed this way. So yes, that's wonderful that Rashi is using lekayim in a verb, in a sentence that begins with a new king kayaming. What did I say? Yeah. Well, Runklos is probably basing himself on the Rashi. Tova. Ein mukdam u'muchar ba'unkelis. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I apologize in advance, but I do historicize this. And I do think it's likely that we're talking about the beginning of the 19th dynasty. And what's interesting about that is the previous dynasty was centered in Thebes, which is the southern part of Egypt. It's not in the Delta. The 19th dynasty was founded by a family that wasn't a royal family, and they were a Delta family. And it's one of the few times in Egyptian history where the central government was actually in the Delta area, as opposed to farther south. And I find that intriguing because that means that in a real sense they might have known, but that's why I asked about acknowledge, because it's one of those things that, in a way, it's easier for a distant government to say these people are useful, they're way up there, they're helping us in certain ways, but they're not a threat. But now there's a dynasty that's literally in the midst of them.
That's great, Tova.
And all the more so, the very nearness of them makes them a much greater threat.
That's great. And also, therefore, nearer to where they come from and where we'd like them to go back to.
100%. Because, in fact,
Great.
the family that dynasty came from were a military family that was stationed in Tanis after the Hyksos had been driven out.
Wow.
That is, the Semitic rulers at the beginning of the previous dynasty had been driven out and then had stayed there and become priests of,
Well, it's a version of imagining what American diplomacy or politics might be under any administration if the capital were moved to San Diego. Right, or any border town, right? Like it would even unconsciously would impact how a leader of any party would think about what it means to be a border city, border nation. Last few comments, then we'll Leonard.
So regarding the word yada,
yes,
the JPS has a couple sentences on what that word really means.
Okay.
In the biblical conception, knowledge is not essentially or even primarily rooted in the intellect and mental activity. Rather, it is experiential and is embedded in the emotions, so that it may encompass such qualities as contact, intimacy, concern, relatedness, and mutuality. Conversely, not to know is synonymous with disassociation, indifference, alienation, and estrangement.
Great.
It culminates in callous disregard for another's humanity.
I'll leave you with one word. It's actually a part of a verb form. When Everett Fox, who knows all of this material and now has to take the material and translate this sentence, which again everyone knows what it means, but no one knows what it means. He adds a word that changes the tense. Now a new king arose over Egypt, fine, who had not known Yosef. He puts a had in there. Hebrew does not have a pluperfect, but English does, right? Had known is different than known. How it's different is very interesting. You could write an essay on how it's different, but it's different. And what you can think about between now and next week is what is Everett Fox trying to say about what was and what was not known by adding in the had. Not that who didn't know Yosef, but who had not known Yosef. You can sense that there's something important in that choice. I'd love to invite him in and discuss the use of that word had, but I know he's onto something. My guess is that next week, first I hope we're meeting in person next week, but I obviously will let you know if that doesn't happen. We're going to read Rashi on this and several other commentaries on the page because it's really wonderful and so timely to figure out how we deal with the information we know and the information we pretend not to know.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.